Let's solve Only Murders in the Building. Episode 2, Who is Tim Kono? We'll be breaking down each episode for clues, suspects, and red herrings on our hunt to learn who killed Tim Kono. And maybe, who killed Zoe Cassidy. Hi, I'm your detective, and I'm leading us through spoilers for the first 2 episodes. If you haven't watched the first 2 episodes of Only Murders in the Building, treat this like a fire alarm, run down the building, escape, get away from this podcast, come back when you've watched the first 2. As I mentioned, we may have 2 murders to solve, as well as 2 rings to keep track of, and our cat tracker gets introduced this week. If you're listening to the podcast version of this, know that on our YouTube version, we're putting up screen grabs of the visual clues that the listeners need to know. We're going to begin this week with actual feedback. This feedback came from our YouTube channel. I'm not even going to try to pronounce this person's YouTube handle, but they wrote, I hadn't heard of this show before, but when I saw you made a podcast about the first episode, I went to go watch it. I really liked Oliver. He's such a quirky guy. Though I didn't suspect Mabel when I watched the episode, some of your points kind of make sense, and it's really suspicious that she didn't tell anybody about her relation to the victim. Well, I don't think she's the murderer. I wonder what the guy in the white hoodie was doing. I found it quite suspicious that he walked up the stairs when the alarm was going off. He was pointed out so sharply in that moment, yet Charles didn't say anything about him to the others, which is strange. Maybe he had something to do with the murder. He is known to the viewer, but still kept a secret, and we don't learn anything about him. I think Hoodie Guy has a secret. Greetings from Germany. Love your podcast. Well, thank you, feedback writer, for that feedback. Listeners, be sure to check out all our podcasts by viewing our Facebook page, facebook.com/doublephq, or our Twitter and Instagram @doublephq. That's the word double, the single letter P as in podcast, HQ for headquarters. Please subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, however you get it, on YouTube, subscribe, and give that like button a tickle. If you don't, they may be throwing a memorial in the lobby for you. Okay, once again, I'm your lead detective leading you through the case, and episode 2, Who is Tim Kono, had exposition galore. This second episode introduced Tim's backstory and taught us about all the Hardy Boys, plus we met a host of new neighbors, but as to who the killer is, I don't believe there's a new frontrunner. Mabel still has to be on top of the leaderboard. Before we run down the suspects, let's review what we know about the victim. Tim Kono lived on the 9th floor, next to Miss Adoko. His body is currently being shipped off to Japan. He was living in the building when he was 10 years old. The show implies that he lived there continuously through the rest of his life. He was a childhood friend of Mabel and a teenage friend of Mabel, as well as Zoe and the super son Oscar, aka the 4 of them are the Hardy Boys. It's said that Tim Kono had bad asthma, though through all the various scenes of Tim, we've never seen him suffering from asthma. This asthma apparently caused the building to stop using fireplaces. His apartment is loaded with overdue bills as well as, sex toys. In Tim's apartment, the Hardy Boy books are on the shelf, and they've been hollowed out, and they contain lots of jewelry, probably from Zoe's thefts back during their Hardy Boy days. The final thing we see is, when he met Mabel when they were 10, he kept the picture of Mabel's hometown, Bayport, that she gave to him. While the first episode wanted us to figure out who killed Tim Kono, it's the second episode and we may have a second mystery already. Who killed Zoe Cassidy? Thanks a lot, Steve Martin. Zoe was another member of the Hardy Boys. She was a teenage girlfriend to Oscar. Her family owned the whole 11th floor. She stole jewelry and prescription medication from people's apartments. Did she steal the engagement ring that we're focused on in present day? Zoe has a whale tattoo on her shoulder, matching the one that Mabel has. 10 years ago, on a New Year's Eve, Mabel notes Zoe is wearing a big black ring. We should assume she stole that ring from somebody's apartment. Later on, at a rooftop party, Mabel complains that Oscar was cheating on her, but we have no idea who he was fooling around with. It could have actually been Mabel. In the shot of Zoe as she falls to the concrete, If you look at her hands, it doesn't appear that she's wearing the big black ring, which she had been wearing earlier. We're going to want to be keeping an eye out for that second ring. We have the engagement ring, but now we need to think about this big black ring. Look at this picture of the Hardy Boys, the 4 of them there. Zoe has her hand up on Oscar's shoulder, almost like showing the ring to everybody and the camera. We need to keep track of where that big black ring is. Now, later on at this New Year's Eve party, Tim Kono claims to have seen a mysterious someone arguing with Zoe before she fell or she was pushed and killed. Either A, Tim Kono is lying and he killed Zoe, or B, he saw someone and it could be any one of our suspects. So we've discussed our victims, Tim Kono and Zoe Cassidy. Before we even get into our clues, there's a question I'm asking myself. Is solving this mystery worth the effort? What do I mean by that? If Zoe fell off the Arconia, or she was pushed off the Arconia 10 years prior, how is it that residents of the Arconia, like Charles, who have lived in this building for decades, how is it they don't know or remember, hey, that Tim Kono had a connection to Zoe who fell off? How is it they don't recognize Mabel as, hey, aren't you that little girl that used to play in the courtyard? Is this a hint of, hey, they don't remember because Mabel's story is false? Or is this just a plot hole that we should ignore? What do you think? Write down in the comments on YouTube, write us on Facebook, facebook.com/DoublePHQ, Twitter and Instagram, DoublePHQ. Should we bother trying to figure out who killed these 2 victims? Write us and let us know. Before we get to our suspects, let's look at some meta clues. And what do I mean by meta clues? Well, in the first episode in the podcast All Is Not Okay in Oklahoma, the podcast host mentions that there's a character there who's oddly dressed for Oklahoma farm life. Is this a meta clue? Meaning, should we be looking for a suspect who's oddly dressed for New York City life? Another option. In episode 2, Mabel is watching a repeat of the old cop show Brazos, and the criminal Zeus is using a fake name. His name isn't Zeus, his real name is Mario Furstenberg. Also, Zeus and Mario is whining that his mom couldn't come to the bar mitzvah. Should we be looking for fake names? Should we be looking for somebody who has mother issues? Finally, we have the whale tattoos and an actual Hardy Boys mystery book, The Mystery of the Whale Tattoo. Now, in that book, the Hardy Boys try to solve the mystery of pickpockets at a traveling carnival. Both of the Hardy Boys had something very valuable stolen from them, and later find out a group of teenagers who are the culprits, and each one of the group has a whale tattoo. Okay, they're not pickpockets at a traveling carnival, but the Hardy Boys, the 4 characters who exist in Only Murders at the Building, they are not pickpockets, but they are going into people's apartments and taking things. Should we assume the male members of the Hardy Boys, Tim Kono and Oscar, should we assume they have those whale tattoos too? We shall see. Again, before we look at our usual suspects, aka the most likely suspects, let's look at the unusual or least likely suspects. Jackie Hoffman, aka Bird Lady. In episode 2, we learned that Tim yelled at her for smoking outside. Ursula, the woman who distributes mail in the Arconia. We find out she has a bunch of side hustles, including gut milk. There was no mention or discussion of the mystery person of the white jumper in this episode, but let's keep them on the back burner. Bunny in this episode didn't do much, but we did learn that Bunny knows sign language. How did we learn that? Well, while Oliver was talking at the memorial for Tim Kono, if you look over his shoulder, we see Bunny doing sign language communication with a new character and possibly a new suspect. This unnamed character we can assume is the son of owner Teddy Demas, who lives in the building. Who is Teddy Demas? He's the owner of Demas Deli, who created that spread. We learned all of this from Oliver as he was eating his delicious dips. A new unusual suspect, and one that may get bumped up into likely suspect category, is Howard Morris. Howard's dead cat Evelyn died the same night as Tim Kono. Evelyn the cat left bloody paw prints all over Tim Kono's apartment, meaning she got in after he was dead. How did Evelyn get in? Well, number one, isn't it a bit bizarre that during a fire alarm, Howard would just let his cat roam around and not grab her and get her out of the building if there was an actual fire? Plus, Evelyn visited people through window boxes. Is that how the cat got into Tim Kono's apartment or how she got out. We're going to talk about Evelyn the cat a bit later, as the cat may point to another suspect. A new neighbor, Amy, sits next to Jackie Hoffman at Tim Kono's memorial. We see Dr. Grover Stanley, who lives on the 6th floor, aka he would have had to walk up the flight of stairs like the person in the white jumper if he was going to go up to Tim Kono's apartment and kill him on the 9th floor. Finally, we met the neighbor, Miss Adoko, who wants Tim Kono's apartment. She has lived next to Tim for 8 years. There's a character who was in episode 1 and episode 2 who we won't talk about. That's Lester the doorman. The way the show is treating him, we should assume all the information we learn from him is factually correct. If Lester the doorman says that nobody except people who live at the Arconia got into the building the night of the murder, we should trust him. Though wouldn't you wonder if maybe a fireman could get in? Okay, let's go to our Big Three, or this week, as it's known, the Big Four. We have a new member of the likely/usual suspect list, Oscar, the other male member of the Hardy Boys. It should be noted that Oscar is played by Aaron Dominguez, whose name is listed 4th in the credits. We find out that Oscar's getting out. The implication is that Oscar's been somewhere he couldn't get out of for the 10 years since Zoe's death. As the Supers kid, Zoe made Oscar copy his dad's keys so they could break into everybody's apartment. In the past, did they break into Charles or Oliver's apartment or another character in the Arconia? Most likely. What would they have taken? We've got to keep an eye on Oscar, even though we haven't exactly seen him in the present, unless he's the white hoodie guy. Next on our big suspects is Oliver Putnam. In a lot of ways, you would think, well, there was nothing new about Oliver in this episode. He's still broke. He still needs money. There was one thing, though. With the introduction of Evelyn the cat being dead, go back to the first episode and look at this. When Oliver exits the elevator to go to his apartment, who's there on the 10th floor? Evelyn the cat is on the 10th floor. That's the last place she was seen before she ended up dead. Is it possible Evelyn followed Oliver as he went down to the 9th floor to kill Tim? That's our cat tracker for this week. We learned new facts about suspect Charles Hayden Savage this week, too. We know that Charles is not only lying, but he's stealing his lines from the TV show about his relationship with his mother and father. He claims that he wrote it from the show, but as Mabel says, you would repeat it verbatim back to me? That's very fishy, and you would suspect Charles is still lying about that. One thing the show keeps doing is Charles keeps asking for the engagement ring. It's presented as if, ooh, Mabel doesn't want to give up the ring. Mabel doesn't want to give up the ring. But should we be wondering, why does Charles want this engagement ring so bad? Also, it's important to note Charles lives on the 14th floor, above everybody else. Finally, about Charles, after Mabel gave him that long monologue about the Hardy Boys when she was young, how does Charles not notice all the Hardy Boy novels within Tim Kono's apartment? For the second week in a row, I think our main suspect is the double M, Mabel Mora. Mabel disappeared for 10 years, according to that flashback where she saw Tim. Why did she disappear for 10 years? Where was she? Now, Mabel records a video which implies she's doing it because she thinks she'll be the next victim. Once again, we're taking her word for this. Who's to say that she isn't faking that she thinks she'll be a victim because she's the actual criminal? Similarly, as in episode 1, I suspected that she planted the engagement ring package in Bunny's apartment and then brought Charles to discover it with her to throw off the scent that she had planted it there. Mabel's aunt is Salma Ramirez, who lives on the 12th floor. There's something odd about this part of the story. I want to see where Salma Ramirez is. Mabel claims that her home was on Long Island Bayport. This is an assumption, but since we haven't seen any other options, it's most likely that Oscar was fooling around with Mabel behind Zoe's back. You might ask yourself, when we see these flashbacks, or when we see the conversation between Mabel and dead Tim Kono, should we accept these as true things that happen, true thoughts that Mabel has? For now, we will, but we always want to keep a little bit of skepticism when we look at it. One final note for episode 2 is Mabel doesn't wear the engagement ring in front of Charles or Oliver, but when she's searching Tim's apartment, she is wearing it. That's our look at episode 2, Who is Tim Kono? Who do you suspect is the killer? Write us, let us know. On Facebook, we're facebook.com/doublephq, Twitter and Instagram @doublephq, the word double, the single letter P, the letters HQ for headquarters. Or if you're on YouTube, like the video and leave us some comments. Did we miss any clues? Let us know. We'll be back in a bit to break down clues of episode 3.